please join me in welcoming Dawn for what will be an interesting talk.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for inviting me here to speak today. Someone asked me earlier if I was nervous, and I've said yes, I am. I'm a researcher by trade, as Claire explained, and I like sitting behind a desk, safely behind my computer screen, or poking around in archives. This isn't something I do regularly, so bear with me. I also should thank the History Trust of South Australian History Fund. I recently was awarded a small grant from them to continue the research. I finished my master's last year, and for those of you that do family history, you'll know it's addictive, it becomes obsessive, it becomes all-consuming, and this is something that I talk about a lot with the family. You know, they're very patient with me, and I managed to get the grant, and I'm continuing with the research. I'm doing more data collection for the rest of this year. And then what I'd like to do is write a book about the topic. So as Claire said, my husband's great-grandmother, Emily, she was admitted to the lying-in department in 1891. Her mother was a widow, and she was described as in poor circumstances, having a young family by a second husband to support by her own exertions, and she was unable to provide for Emily in her confinement. Emily gave birth 3 days after she was admitted. And like the majority of women who were admitted to the lying-in department, she was unmarried, and she had been recently employed as a domestic servant. During her stay, she would have been fully occupied nursing her baby son, and she would have been required to naturally suckle her infant. That was one of the requirements of staying. And she also had to carry out domestic work, both for the lying-in department and the women also did the laundry for the rest of the Destitute Asylum inmates. So Emily's story is fairly typical of lots of the women that were admitted to the lying-in department, and she was really the person that kind of set me off on this research. I should just quickly say that the title of the talk, Refuge of Last Resort, that quotation is taken from Brian Dickey's seminal text on social welfare history in this country, Rations, Residence and Resources, bit of a tongue twister. So at the time of the study that I conducted, the Destitute Asylum was the only place in South Australia that offered public facilities for confinement of destitute women. Confinement is just another way of talking about giving birth. The alternative at this time was the cost of a midwife. So you needed to pay for a midwife, but you also needed to have a roof over your head, a room in which you could give birth. The Adelaide hospital at this time of the study, which I looked at the women that were in the Destitute Asylum between 1880 and 1918. During that period, the Adelaide hospital didn't have lying-in facilities, they didn't have a ward, and they wouldn't take cases. There's quite a number of instances where women were maybe sick in Adelaide hospital, and then they were referred to the Destitute Asylum to actually give birth. So I wanted to find out more about who were these women and how did they find themselves requiring admission, what led up to their admission, and what became of them afterwards. I should say I call them women, that's the term that I've been using. They were also called inmates in the literature, they were also called girls, and they were sometimes called females. I tend to refer to them as women because it's easier, but as we'll see, quite a number of them were actually girls. They were under 16. So just bearing that in mind when I talk about women. So as we know, at the heart of the design of South Australia was this idea that land sales would fund free passages for emigrants, and they would be carefully selected. So when the commissioners were coming up with the design of South Australia, the idea of destitution didn't really feature. In fact, I think there were a couple of people that did talk about the possibility of destitution, but it was kind of, no one thought it was going to be an issue. But by 1849, a destitute board was set up because there were groups of people who did need social welfare support. So there were a number of groups that were distinguished. So it was people like the elderly, the sick, children, deserted wives were some typical groups. And another group that was identified in the early 1850s were women who required lying-in relief. Lying-in was the term used for women who, in the lead up to their pregnancy, during their birthing period, and for a short period afterwards. So despite the Destitute Board's misgivings about providing welfare for the women of the lying-in department, most of them were unwed, and so they were perceived to be immoral and engaging in promiscuous behaviour. They did actually take them all in, because the alternative would have been for these women to give birth in the street or in the bush, and the Destitute Board realised that this would actually not really be a very good look. But from the outset, the Destitute Asylum was overcrowded. It was founded in 1851 on North Terrace, and it really consisted of a patchwork of buildings. And I think it was donated a building to start with, and then what happened over the years until it closed in 1917 was that it would beg or borrow a building from here or there. And so overcrowding was always an issue, and rooms and buildings were kind of allocated on a as-needed basis. And so the use of particular buildings fluctuated over the years, depending on changing needs and circumstances. So, for example, the chapel, which is still standing at the Migration Museum, that was actually originally built as the schoolroom for the Destitute Asylum children in 1865. And then in the 1870s, it then became the chapel. And that happened with a lot of the buildings. So the main aim of the Destitute Board was to categorise the different types of people who needed help. So they wanted to separate the elderly from the sick and the children from the adults. But they also wanted to segregate the pregnant women. So they wanted to have the married women separated from the fallen women, and then they wanted to separate that group from the women that had fallen more than once or indeed were prostitutes. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. I don't know how clearly you can see that, but those maps, one from 1878 and one from 1895, illustrate the site of the Destitute Asylum. So that one there you can see is quite empty, and then the 1895 version is quite full. You can see how the buildings have kind of grown up over time. And then this shows you the building from 1868, and then again in, I can't see, 1936. So that was actually taken after the asylum closed in 1917. So this notion that the Destitute Asylum wanted to separate women was often impossible, because there just wasn't a lack of there wasn't the accommodation. They didn't have the space to do the categorisation that they wanted to do. They did make attempts throughout the years. So in 1856, there's a select committee report that does indicate that there was a lying-in room available for women. Then in 1865, moving on 11 years, there is a note that the women's quarters did have an apartment for lying-in women, but it was described as being dirty and very ill ventilated. It cannot be aired without creating a draught, which of course would be dangerous to the inmates. And then in 1866, a Destitute Board report mentioned the crowded state of the Destitute Asylum. This was often a problem that was recorded in the Destitute Board reports. And they were requesting a ward for lying-in women in the Adelaide hospital, so that they could separate women who were lying in from the other female inmates. And the report lamented that in more cases than one during the last 6 months, respectable married women have been compelled to go through the trials of childbirth in the same crowded ward with a diseased prostitute. It's very interesting reading these old reports. It gives you a glimpse into, attitudes of the time. And this same report voiced concerns about fallen women being a bad influence on young girls. And the report said that young girls were being seduced under the persuasion of the prostitute class of women to take a life of infamy. Another report of 1867 reported on the inadequacy of the women's quarters, and this applied to the men's quarters as well, but I'm really just focusing on the women. The rooms were really unfit for purpose. So, for example, on a hot or a wet day, the dining rooms were overcrowded, and by night they had to be turned into dormitories. So it really wasn't satisfactory. In 1867, there was a committee of the Legislative Council on Destitute Establishments in the colony, and they observed that your committee are informed that in the females' quarters there are no means of separating women admitted for their confinement from the other female inmates. And again, they suggested a lying-in ward should be built in connection with the hospital. In 1868, the Destitute Board did actually manage to rent some houses, 2 properties in Flinders Street, and there is a register for the Flinders Street lying-in home, as it was called, which was only really in operation for about 2 or 3 years. So it's slim, but it does record the women that were confined there. But then in 1870, the Destitute Board obtained the military barracks, which was next door to the Destitute Asylum. And so they brought the lying-in department back so that it became a part of the bigger Destitute Asylum complex. And they referred to this building as having the character of a real refuge where the inmates have been kept in thorough privacy and seclusion, unvisited by any save a nearest relative, so as to conceal as far as possible this portion of their life from those outside. And around about this time, the girls' reformatory was located right next to the lying-in wards of the main Destitute Asylum, and they had to share common rooms. So the new mothers or the mothers-to-be were sharing washing facilities, washrooms, and the kitchen with the girls. And there were a couple of kind of outbreaks of poor behaviour among these girls in the early 1870s. And in fact, they destroyed everything in sight. They tore up their bedding. They tore up their mattresses. Several of the girls ended up in court and were charged with various offences. And really, the upshot of this is that it was considered inappropriate for the girls to be living side by side with the new and young mothers. And so finally, one assumes in response to this kind of 20 years of issues, the lying-in department was built. I'm wondering if this is, yeah, okay. It was built in 1877 to 1878, and it was designed to accommodate about 30 women at a time. It was often over capacity in the early years. And for example, on the 30th of June, 1886, it had 44 women housed in the building. So I call it the lying-in department because that's how the Destitute Board reported it, but it's often variously referred to as the lying-in ward, the lying-in hospital, or the lying-in home. And be aware that the wards of the Destitute Asylum were also called the lying-in ward, but they were the wards that were there before the independent building was built. So this is a picture of the front of the building. I've taken kind of like well, I didn't take the before one, obviously I wasn't around then. But I'm using a before photo and an after photo, because the after photo you can go and visit yourself if you haven't already done so. The before photo was taken in 1918 after it closed, And you can see that there are ladders and there's work going on, because the building was taken over by the government's Department of Chemistry. The ground floor windows are actually being enlarged. I don't know whether you can see that. It's not a terribly good photo, but it's about the only photo that exists of the lying-in department in those times. The windows were actually being enlarged. They were being enlarged for the Department of Chemistry. And the balcony at the top, I don't know whether you can just see on the left-hand side, the balcony is actually blocked off. That was at the request of the chairman. He wanted the balcony to be blocked off so that the women couldn't speak to anyone on the outside. And so this is the front of the lying-in home, which actually faces into the courtyard. This is the back of the building, which actually faces onto Kintore Avenue. And you can see that the first floor has got windows at the top. Originally, it was built without those windows. There was only the one in the middle, which was at the turn in the stairs. It was designed with windows on the first floor, but the chairman decided to not include those because he wanted to cut costs. But I suspect that he wanted to just have a very plain facade so that no one would really see what was going on in that building. So the women were quite enclosed. I think the effect of having no windows at the back and small windows at the front would have made it quite dark, would have made it quite hot in the summer, and may have made it feel quite claustrophobic. So finally, with this new building, the women who were arriving for lying-in relief could actually be classified into and separated into these three groups. So it was married women, who were few and far between, but there were a number of married women whose husbands had lost their work, for example. So they were housed with the first-time fallen women. If you fell a second time or more, you went to a general women's ward in the main Destitute Asylum. And if you were a prostitute or a woman of doubtful character, you went to the ward for diseased prostitutes. Each applicant was personally interviewed by Mr. Reed. This is Mr. Reed. He was the chairman of the board for many years. He personally interviewed each woman, bearing in mind that we're going to be talking about some girls who were 14, 15. And he decided how they would be categorised and which area of the Destitute Asylum they would go to. And this is something he also said, this is a quote from Mr. Reed: "The falsehoods have been so palpable that more than once a girl has been told to go back and return when she can tell a true story." And I just try and imagine what it would have been like. Your Emily was 3 days, before the birth of her son, how it must have been being interviewed by this man. So I should say, and I was discussing this with Beth earlier, but it was really difficult to find images to illustrate this talk because there are no photographs of the inside of the lying-in home. There are obviously no photographs of the women. So I thought I might use some pictures of the men that were involved in the Destitute Board. This is Dr. James Mann. He was the medical officer to the Destitute Poor in the early 1880s. And he was also on call for births where medical intervention was required. But women like Emily would have been attended by the matron of the lying-in department, who was also a qualified midwife. And I think it's worth pointing out that South Australia was one of the earliest countries to adopt qualified midwifery. They employed certified midwives from as early as 1880, just around the time when the lying-in department opened. And I suspect that might be one of the reasons why it was quite a good idea for some women to come here, because they knew they were getting a qualified midwife. I don't know that you can read this, but when the women were admitted, they had to sign an agreement with the Destitute Board. They had to agree, this was particularly for the unmarried women, they had to agree to compulsory residence for 6 months from the date of the birth of their child. The idea was that the Destitute Board and the government had been concerned about early infant mortality, and they wanted to try and reduce that. And one way they thought of doing that was to increase maternal affection of new mothers for their infants. And this agreement came in shortly after the lying-in department opened, but they also had to agree to carrying out domestic duties as if they were in domestic service for the matron. The matron allotted the duties, so mostly they'd be looking after their children, but they had to keep the lying-in department looked after, and they also did the washing for themselves and for the rest of the asylum. I think they did needlework and things like that as well. They had to agree to identify the putative father, and that was so that the board could try and pursue maintenance payments for the child. And declarations were taken personally by the chairman, T.S. Reid, who we saw earlier. He would go and visit the mothers immediately after they'd given birth and demand to know who the putative father was. The idea was that they would then be able to pursue maintenance payments, but for example, in 1883, they only managed to pursue about 10. You can imagine that it would have been quite difficult. So I think the return for their behaviour was actually quite low. So these women had to remain in the institution under the control of the board until their child, as I say, was 6 months old, until they'd finished being suckled naturally, unless they were signed out by a responsible third party. This was known as the detention clause among the board members, and I'll talk a bit more about signing out when we talk about what happened to the women. They also had to provide details of their whereabouts when they left so that they could get a follow-up home visit or several home visits from the visiting officer. So the women that I included in this study were women who'd been admitted at any stage of their pregnancy, women who left the Destitute Asylum before their confinement but then went back. Some of them obviously didn't like it but went back anyway because they really didn't have any other options. Some young girls were admitted because they thought they were pregnant, but then they turned out not to be. Some women were confined elsewhere, but then admitted with, a 4-day-old or a 2-week-old. I included them, up to 6 weeks old of the baby. And some women were admitted having been charged with infanticide. That was really the ultimate in contraception, if you like. And they often used, the police often used the lying-in department as a kind of way station for women who were heading towards prison. Just briefly, I used the Destitute Asylum registers, most of which are available on Family Search. They're closed for 100 years, so anything that was near to in the volume that went up to 2023, I had to go and visit the state records to see the originals. But I used those to create a data set of all the women that had passed through the lying-in department from 1880 to 1918, because I wanted to kind of do a summary statistics of, how many women there were and who were we talking about. And then I constructed 25 case studies using genealogical research methods for 25 women. And so I used their records, which are brilliant. They're just rich with data if you're into family history, and you happen to have someone, which I think most people do, have at least one family member who passed through the asylum. And then I collected BMD records from Genealogy SA. I went through police records, hospital records, Trove, anything else that might be relevant to kind of construct a family history using Family Tree Maker. So what did I find? Well, I found that between 1880 and 1918, 1,840 women passed through the lying-in department at least once. They ranged in age from 13 to 49 years, and it wasn't unusual for a woman to have 2 or 3 children in the lying-in department. So they were going back for a second or third time. One single woman had 7 children at the Destitute Asylum between 1894 and 1908. And I suspect that she maybe went back there because she knew she was going to get good quality midwifery service. Of course, that's just my guess. In common with other research in other parts of Australasia, nearly half of the women were between the ages of 20 and 24, with over 1/3 aged between 15 and 19. And despite the fact that in South Australia, the age of consent was raised from 13 to 16 in 1885, 10 of the admissions were under the age of 14. Most of the women were single, 89%, and 11% were married. And of interest, 29 of the latter group were widows. So although they were, marked down as married, half of the widows were actually having children that couldn't have been their husbands because their husbands had died too far in the past. So 3/4 of the 840 women were employed in domestic and general service, and this was very common at the time across the Australasian colonies. And domestic service was the leading form of employment for working class women at the time. So what circumstances influenced the women's admission? Well, by looking at the 25 case studies in more detail, I was able to find out a bit more about why they had arrived there. One of the main reasons why they ended up in the Destitute Asylum, because not only did they lose their jobs when their employers found out they were pregnant, but they also lost their accommodation because they were live-in staff. So they lost the roof over their heads as well. Many of the entries in the admissions registers described the women as quite destitute and highlighted intergenerational destitution. So a lot of the younger girls came from families who were in poor circumstances themselves, either with or without large families to support. The father, who was the main breadwinner, was sometimes unemployed, and in one case he was suffering long-term illness and couldn't work. So they came from fairly impoverished circumstances. And in some cases, they were already receiving welfare support in any case. So one woman who suffered from a crippled condition, and her widowed mother, who was very, very elderly, were already receiving outdoor relief. Another woman, a widow, her youngest siblings were receiving relief from the department at the time of her second confinement. So they'd already been in contact with the social welfare of the day. So I included this one of Port Adelaide railway station circa 1906 because, if a woman lost her job and her accommodation, she lacked the resources to actually give birth. She didn't have the money to pay the midwife's fee, and she didn't have a rent for a room. And Ethel, who was a 22-year-old general servant, her circumstances for her second illegitimate confinement are an extreme example of lack of resources. She actually was employed at a hotel in Port Adelaide, and she gave birth to her male son in the waiting room at Port Adelaide railway station 4 days prior to being admitted to the Destitute Asylum. I've no idea what she did in the 4 days. One can only really imagine. I don't know whether she stayed at the railway station, but she was actually brought into the Destitute Asylum by the police. So a lot of the women, one of the things about the law in South Australia at the time was the belief that if you were destitute, it was up to your relatives to support you. And so one of the things that the registers ask, they have a column of how many relatives do you have in the colony. So if you're doing family history research, that's a fantastic place to get information about someone other than the woman that was being admitted. So they include details about parents, siblings, aunts and uncles. They include ages, names, occupations, even addresses. It's a fantastic resource. But it was quite clear from some of the case studies that it wasn't an option for the younger women to go back home for their confinements. And in some cases, some of the women didn't have any home or family to go back to. They had been in the care of the state themselves, or they were orphaned. And in other cases, often the families had a young family of their own to support. So they couldn't really take on a daughter who left home with who was going to be having an extra mouth to feed eventually. And families were described as just being too poor to provide for their pregnant daughter. One woman, her record said that, she couldn't go back because it wasn't safe because her mother drank, and that mother herself was due to give birth in 3 weeks' time. So there were a couple of occasions where the girls were having babies at the same time as their mothers, who may have been in second marriages. So you can kind of see a picture building up for these women. And in some cases, the families were already looking after an illegitimate child, either of the woman being admitted or of their sister. So they were already looking after an extra child. For the 3 married women that I did case studies on, they'd either been widowed or deserted, so they had also lost their male breadwinner. In one case, one woman was receiving financial support from a fundraising event that her local community organised for her when her husband died. Another one was accepting support from friends when her husband deserted her. And someone else had 3 children already in the care of the destitute persons department. So you can see that these women really were in dire straits. And although the law, as I said, the Destitute Persons Act of 1881 legislated for relatives to maintain their family members, it was actually really difficult to enforce in practice. And one woman who was married for the second time, her record really demonstrated this. He had deserted her 9 weeks before she was admitted to the Destitute Asylum because of action taken by the State Children's Department in endeavouring to compel him to maintain his 3 stepchildren, and a warrant has been issued for his arrest. So you might ask why these women didn't marry the putative father, the unmarried women. There often were genuine obstacles to marriage. So, for example, one woman was already married to someone else. Another one appeared to be in a cohabiting relationship, and I think this was fairly common. I don't know whether you've come across it when you're doing your family history research, but often I found someone who said they were married, they behaved as though they were married, but there's absolutely no record of their marriage, which may have got lost, but I suspect sometimes that they may have been cohabiting. And in a lot of cases, the men were young, they were 19, 20, they were living at home with their mums, they were unemployed. One of them was ill, seriously ill, and he later died. Or they were absent from the colony, whether they were going to be absent anyway or had made themselves absent once they found out the circumstances of the girls. The girls' circumstances, I don't know. That said, one of the case study women did actually marry the father of their child. They'd been in service together interstate. She found out she was pregnant. They both lost their jobs. They came back to South Australia, where he was from. She was from the UK. She had no relatives here. He married her, but then they used up all their savings because he couldn't get work in South Australia. And so she ended up giving birth in the Destitute Asylum. So marriage wasn't always a means of ensuring you weren't going to be poor. It just meant that you were respectably poor. And often the women didn't have any proof of paternity, and this was key. You needed proof of paternity if you were going to try and pursue this through the courts. And that meant either written, like a letter from the man, or a witness who, where the man had admitted he was the father in front of a third party. And without any proof, they didn't really have a leg to stand on. 2 of the case study women, though, they did actually pursue the matter. One woman, before she was confined, she went to see a solicitor, but he told her that she had no proof. And he advised her to take a competent witness and interview her employer, because the employer was the putative father. But this she did not do. I wonder why. Her employer had given her £1 at one time and said he would see her again after her confinement. I don't know whether that occurred. And then another woman's mother went with a Salvation Army officer to interview the putative father, but they could get no satisfaction from him. he is out of employment and living with his mother. So it was very difficult to prove paternity. There was one interesting case where a man of Sarah, who was a 27-year-old servant, he'd initially acknowledged paternity in the presence of her uncle, but he later denied it through his solicitor. But despite this, with the aid of her uncle and her brother, she took legal action against him. She took him to court, and during the hearing, she's there in the courtroom with the baby in her arms. And apparently, this is what the newspaper reported, the evidence was such that he no longer had any doubt that he was the father of her child. And she was awarded 7 shillings and sixpence per week maintenance. So good on her, I say. But she was rare. Sadly, there was evidence in the case studies that some pregnancies may have resulted from coercive or exploitative circumstances. As I said, several of the girls were very young at the time. And I also found that there were a couple of households where girls kept getting pregnant by brothers of the employer. And there was also one man, at least, that was named several times in different admissions records. That's something I'm going to follow up because I didn't have time to do that. Am I running out of time? I suspect I might be. Got a few minutes, okay. So I'm really just giving you a flavour of what I found. What happened to these women after they left? Well, the unmarried women had to stay for 6 months after the birth of their child. If a woman was married, she could leave when the baby was 5 or 6 weeks old. The husband had to sign the form to get her release. A woman could leave, an unmarried woman could leave earlier if she was going to a situation where the employer would take responsibility for the mother, or if she was going to a refuge. In the 1870s, a number of refuges were springing up where women could go with their babies, and they could stay there sometimes for 2 or 3 years at a time. So they could stay there much longer than the Destitute Asylum could provide for. But if they left earlier than 6 months, they had to get the form signed. And the form basically, the person that signed the form was basically agreeing to help the new mother nurture her child so that it had a better chance of survival. Interestingly, I found this really interesting. I haven't really got an explanation for this, but despite the fact that the families could not give the young woman support when she needed confinement help, about half of the case study women actually went home to their families. And I couldn't quite work out why that might be, but I think that's a really interesting finding. I'm going to look into that a bit more. Maybe the mothers had been in to visit the women in the asylum and seen what it was like there and realised that they didn't want their girl there. I don't know. That's a possibility. Several women left to go to employment with their baby. Prospective employers did actually come to the lying-in department to choose a new servant, and they took the baby as well. But the trouble with that was that once the baby became mobile, it was almost impossible to work with a small child. So they often lost their jobs at that stage. One of the sad things I think that I found was that women who were having their second illegitimate child, they must have begun to realise that, you know, finding work was going to be even harder with two. So they either gave up one or other of their children, either the older one or the one that had just been born, to the care of the state children's department. Can you imagine what kind of decision that would have been to have to make? You know, how do you decide which child to surrender? One woman got married in the chapel. Yep. So that's the building that used to be the school building. One woman got married. She was 16 when she got married. She was actually 15 at the time of conception. She did marry the putative father. Sadly, that marriage didn't last, but they did have more children. And then one woman married the putative father about 10 years later. But most of the women probably didn't see these young men again. But they did all end up getting married and having families later down the line. Some left without their infants, either because they chose to surrender them at that point, or unfortunately quite a number of them died. Infant mortality at this time was common, and it was higher in illegitimate births than it was in married births. I'm going to speed up now. One more. The next slide is a picture of McGill Industrial School. So this is where the girls who were underage were sent back to, and this is where the children, the babies, would have gone to if they were being surrendered. And this slide is the Queen's Home at Rose Park. It was the first public maternity home built in South Australia. It opened in 1902, and in 1917, the Destitute Asylum moved from North Terrace to McGill, and the following year, the lying-in department was closed. And with the enactment of the Maternity Allowance Act in 1912, which gave a £5 payment to all new mothers, which was intended to cover medical costs, the requirement for a lying-in department completely plummeted. And then from 1917, the Queen's Home finally agreed to accept unmarried women. They wouldn't when it first opened in 1902, but once those two things occurred, the maternity allowance and the public facilities for unmarried women, there became no need for a lying-in department. I could go on, or I could stop at this point. Okay, so one of the things I had a quick look at was, depending on who you spoke to or who was asked about the lying-in department, they described it in different terms. Mr. Solomon, he was the chair of the Destitute Board in 1880, and he said in his report that the lying-in department, this was the newly opened lying-in department, it's known all over the colony, as well as in Queensland and Western Australia, as being a very comfortable lying-in hospital. The result of such reputed comfort has been to bring females from every part of this colony. Well, yes, they did come from every part of this colony, because that was the intention. It was supposed to be for the whole of South Australia. And I've only found one or two women that actually came from beyond our borders. Mr. Malcolm Henry Davis, who was a member of the Destitute Board in 1883, he said, "There's no means of relaxation. The girls are shut up for 6 months in a place more like a jail and jail yard than anything else." If you remember those photographs, the courtyard, or the yard that the lying-in home faced, was bricked in on all sides, had no contact with anyone else. No visitors were allowed apart from the clergy, the doctor, or their mothers. So they were very, very isolated. Another member of the Destitute Board said, "It's a great deal better than the homes they would have to go to if they had not this place." And Lady Audrey Tennyson, the governor's wife, in 1900, she was a regular visitor to the lying-in department. She said, "It's a bright, sunny courtyard with extremely nice rooms and offices." So Emily, we'll just go back to Emily quickly, who my husband's great-grandmother, she left the institution with her mother, who couldn't look after her at her time of confinement, but she actually left when her son was 9 months old. So she actually stayed an extra 3 months, and that was at the government's expense, because this was all paid for by the government. She was only 16, as I say, so it may be that this really did act as a refuge for her. But other young women voted with their feet. Some, as I said, left before confinement and were confined elsewhere. And there were a handful of girls who absconded over the wall. And this was what was written in their record. They were known as absconders. So I feel like they probably voted with their feet. And a couple of them actually absconded over the wall with their baby tucked under their arms. So I just want to add a word of caution before I finish about Emily, my relative by marriage. A certain man was named as a putative father in her record when she was 16. He was followed up by the police, and he was described as, a perfect larrikin. And the employer said, "You're not going to get any joy there." Well, as it turned out, now that we have DNA available, someone in the family took a DNA test and found out that this perfect larrikin was not actually the father of Emily's child. The father was actually her employer. And I suspect that the reason a lot of the women told falsehoods, as the chairman suggested, was because they were protecting possibly their employers, possibly someone else. So I think I'll end there, but if anyone's got any questions, I'd be very happy to answer.
Intriguing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been amazing to learn as what we have tonight. My question is the building at McGill looks like a very big structure. Is it still standing? Do you know?
So that building is the industrial school. I suspect it isn't. I'm not entirely sure. Does anyone here know? It's not, no.
Okay, thank you.
Just a comment and then a question from that. Having gone through a very traumatic childbirth myself at the age of 19, many years ago, not the only one I'm sure here, when I first visited the Destitute Asylum some years ago, there was a cabinet full of the most terrifying looking, I don't even want to think about it now because I actually found it quite traumatic.
Yeah.
And I'm not terribly faint-hearted normally, but I did have to go and sit down because I felt faint because those things bring back a memory. And I thought, thank God I didn't have to deal with those. Or if I did, I wasn't awake to see them. But it made me think so much about, it's not so much the childbirth and then what you're dealing with when the maternal instincts take over and whatever, but you're talking about, children as young as 13 and what they may have gone through. I don't know if you've got any observations or investigations into that, but also perhaps in terms of those who may, like statistics of those who did not survive, or perhaps, thanks heavens, despite those instruments, they were actually there to have the children. Some thoughts on the medical attention that they did get. I think you did kind of allude to that.
That case of instruments is still there. I know the one you mean. And in fact,
that's why I haven't gone back.
If you're interested in this topic and you haven't been, then I meant to mention this. The Migration Museum has a permanent exhibition that's housed in the lying-in department in the matrons, what was the old matrons' quarters, called In This Place. And it talks about the history of the building and what happened after it closed. But it's got an amazing exhibition. They actually did a study of the number of babies that were born there. It was something like 1,600 babies between 1880 and 1909. And they've got, each baby has been given like a sticker and they're hanging from the ceiling. It's quite an interesting place to go. It's very moving for me that has no connection with it like you have. So I can imagine that it would be quite confronting. In terms of the medical attention, there is a really interesting article by Bronte Gould. She carried out a study of the medicalisation of midwives, which, as I say, South Australia was one of the first jurisdictions to introduce certified midwives, and they were qualified to deliver the babies where there was no medical intervention required. If medical intervention was required, then they had to call a medical doctor from the hospital would come along. I don't know how many of those were required. It's possible that wasn't recorded by the Destitute Board. A lot of what I've talked about today comes from the Destitute Board reports, which are freely available online. I don't recall any recollection of there being specific details about whether medical intervention was required, but they did keep statistics of mothers who died during childbirth, and it wasn't that many. I remember when I put together the figures for the number of deaths per year, being pleasantly surprised that it really wasn't that many. Well, I think that's what I'm saying, really. And I think they were ahead of their time. The midwives were offering a fantastic service. And I think that's one of the reasons why some women may have gone back there regularly, because they knew they were getting a reliable service from a qualified, certified midwife. One of the midwives that was operating round about this time, she came from Scotland, and she got her qualification in Scotland and it was recognised here. But Bronte Gould has written a really interesting article about the midwives and the doctors and the certification of midwives. That's really where I got a lot of that information from. I recommend that.
Thank you. That was a fabulous talk.
Thank you.
I just wonder, in terms of statistics or information that's in the records, is the religion of the person recorded? Because I know in the hospital records, for example, religion is usually recorded. And if it was, did any particular religion predominate in the records? And would you link that at all to the strictness, I suppose, of the attitude of the religions?
Yeah, they did collect religion, and I did analyse that for the thesis. I can't remember off the top of my head what the stats were, but I don't recall that there wasn't really any meaningful correlation, with anything else. So I know what you're saying, maybe about moral standards of the different religions. There wasn't anything noticeable at all. In fact, I mean, a lot of them were, there was a real mixture of Roman Catholic, Lutheran, and Church of England, and quite a few nonconformists as well.
Thank you, Dawn. That was very informative.
Oh,
Can
thank
you
you.
please help me understand the term outdoor relief
Oh,
in
yes.
terms of destitute asylum?
Yes. So outdoor relief was one of the things that the destitute. What I should have said was the Destitute Board were responsible for managing the asylum, the lying-in department, which was indoor relief. So that's where people went and stayed inside. They were also responsible for managing outdoor relief, which is where people could apply to them for rations. So that was mainly food, and there was a certain allocation per adult per week. And outdoor relief was provided more or less from the day the colony started, both here and in the country areas. You had to apply for it. You might not have got it. Sometimes I've seen records where there was a family of, say, 2 adults and 4 children, and they might get rations for 3. So it would have been a struggle. I'm not sure that they got anything else. I know that in England, in England, outdoor rations might include firewood and things like that, but I haven't seen any mention of that.
Thank you, Dawn. I remember when I was at university in the 80s, it was a derelict place. It was all boarded up, and then there was a metamorphosis, I think in the late 80s when they started to renovate it. But in terms of social policy, how did it rate, say, amongst similar cities in the British Commonwealth at the time?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that, because actually I think it rated really highly. Because when the colony was designed, there was no real thought of destitution. And because the government had basically brought migrants over here, paid their free passage, promised them jobs, promised them land, the posters for the migration adverts, they felt a responsibility towards the migrants when they arrived if they didn't have work. And so that's really how social welfare in this state started. And so the government paid for all this social welfare that I've been talking about, which is really unusual. In most other states, in Australasia, this kind of welfare was funded by charitable organisations, philanthropists, and maybe partly by the government. So I feel like the social policy here was actually quite amazing. And although they didn't have to accept everybody, for example, I know I said that the chairman would send the women back. I think he was actually quite soft-hearted. He was chairman for getting on for about 15, 20 years. He had a break because of illness, but he then came back. This is Thomas Sadler-Reid I'm talking about. When I've read because there was a commission into the Destitute Persons Act of 1881 that was conducted in 1883. There's a massive volume that records all the minutes, everything everybody said during the interviews for the commission, which is available in the State Library. And a lot, I was reading it as I do, a bit of a nerd, reading it in the State Library a couple of weeks ago. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised by a lot of what Thomas Reid said. He seemed to be really quite sympathetic towards making sure that destitute people got what they needed. And he had as long as he complied with the legislation of the day, he seemed to have a fairly free rein. He had a loud voice. Thank you.